Hello, and welcome to today's Spigit webinar, Bringing Ideas to Market with Launchpad Central, with Jim Hornthal, Executive Chairman of Launchpad, and Amy Millard, Chief Marketing Officer at Spigit.
So welcome, everybody. It's going to be an exciting topic today, and I know it's one that we hear a lot of interest about, so I'm looking forward to Jim's discussion. By way of background, I am the Chief Marketing Officer of Spigit, and next time I'm going to take all those years of experience off the slide so nobody knows. Jim is an entrepreneur, an angel investor, as well as a professor at both UC Berkeley and Stanford. Launchpad is a partner of Spigit's, and I'm going to be talking a little bit more about that. Jim is an accomplished speaker. He just spoke at Ignite last week, and his presentation was fantastic. So I'm looking forward to today's content. Next slide, Hannah. So by way of background, at Spigit, for those who are not familiar with us, our mission is to help our customers harness the collective intelligence of their employees, their customers, and their partners to solve today's problems and maximize tomorrow's opportunities. Next slide. For those who are not familiar with us, we are the largest player in ideation management. We are 4 times larger than our nearest competitor. We've been growing about 40% a year last year and 120% the year before that. So we're growing quickly. Next slide. And if you could build out the animation. Thank you, Hannah. So Spigit powers ideation for leading enterprises in energy, financial services, healthcare, consumer products, manufacturing, construction, technology. And to date, we have over 6.5 million users. We've run over 13,500 communities and challenges, and out of those, over 100,000 winning ideas. The reason we talk about these numbers, next slide, is that those numbers have given us an opportunity to learn about what is important in ideation management. And we've learned over the years that ideation must be managed just like any other critical business process. And what we mean by that is that so many systems and so many programs, ideation is happenstance or not necessarily managed from beginning to end, so that implementable ideas that drive revenue or significant cost savings for the company, come out of these processes. We believe that organizations need an accelerated pipeline of the best and most actionable ideas that are vetted and ready for validation. We're going to be talking a lot more about what that validation process would look like with Jim a little bit later. Next slide. So Spigit is a complete ideation management solution. We combine technology, methodology, patented crowd science algorithms, and unique services to solve complex business problems. Spigit is scalable to the enterprise. It is flexible and adaptable to methods and challenges, and is built to lead your program and last whether or not you have 100 employees or 100,000 employees. Recently, Spigit announced a technology partner program that takes advantages of Spigit APIs, and the very first partner that we announced as part of that program was Launchpad Central. Launchpad is a great partner of ours, and we've asked them to speak today about that process for bringing ideas to market once they have made it through the Spigit ideation process. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jim to talk a little bit more, and then we'll take some questions at the end. Feel free to answer questions in the question box along the way, and Hannah will make sure to ask them of us. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you everyone for being here today at the Spigit Launchpad webinar. And I think let's go to the next slide, if we could. So what we're seeing in a lot of the large enterprises that we work with is the challenge of taking a concept, an idea, something that is feasible, and understanding within the organization who's responsible for taking it out of the lab, out of R&D, and into a more profitable domain, not just research and development, but research and commercialization. And so as we think about these challenges within the organization, a lot of it is devising metrics and processes that can break through what's often a bottleneck or choked pipeline. And while Spigit has got incredible skill and experience at filling the top of the funnel and getting those best ideas to the surface, there's still a challenge of taking those great ideas and polishing them to the point where they can be commercialized. Next slide, please. So what do we see happening a lot? Well, often the silos of innovation are stuck in either divisions or geographies, and the sharing of all the experience is difficult. Really determining which projects in the innovation portfolio deserve the highest priority is often done in a vacuum. And we think there are some new metrics and new techniques that can be applied, because what makes companies successful in their execution is focus. And it's very often that focus that actually limits their ability to discover new opportunities. An article this month in the Stanford Graduate School of Business on innovation and technology actually talks that most new innovations are not planned, but they are discovered. So what we see in this sea of opportunity is a requirement for new methods, tools, and metrics that allow leverage, because ultimately the goal is to accelerate the time to truth within the organization and let them move forward with a determination and the metrics that can buy success. So if we can go to the next slide. Here's what we've learned looking at 15,000 teams in our platform. Not one of them wound up where they began. That they all have some subtle, some dramatic changes, sometimes in value propositions, customer segments, channels, sometimes in pricing models. And as those changes are made, those little failures along the way to success, often those are lost on erased whiteboards, thrown out Post-it notes, buried emails. And the question is, are there ways of collecting those artifacts and reanimating them and repurposing them for the sake of the current and future innovation teams that will be managing their future agendas in light of the changing economic, competitive, and technological marketplace that we live in? So when we set about building a system, it actually had to do with building archives of failure to provide leverage for success. So on the next slide, we're going to diagrammatically take a look at this. And what you've got in the slide coming up, here we go, next slide, please. There we go. So as we think about the first phase of a process, it's really idea generation. And everyone is ready, geared, and capable of execution. And that valley of death in the middle is where things often go awry. The genesis of Launchpad Central started 5 years ago when a gentleman named Errol Arkwich was creating a new program for the National Science Foundation called I-Corps. So the NSF has a 40-year history with bipartisan support of spending $7 billion a year on basic academic research. In 2016, there were 11,000 of the brightest men and women on the planet who are doing work in an American university that could apply for and receive funding to see how solid their science, their advancements could be. And Errol Arkwich was looking at the NSF portfolio and said, we are awesome at idea generation. There were 550,000 patents issued by the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. So if you want to see, as a country, are we good at idea generation, patents are a reasonable surrogate, check the box. But where Errol was frustrated is a lot of these innovations were lost in the lab. They never could get out into the marketplace and create value. And the reason that we support this in Congress for 40 years is that we believe that innovation leads to job creation and sometimes industry formation. And the poster child for that hypothesis is Sergey Brin and Larry Page at Stanford, who got an NSF grant to work on their search project, which became Google. Many other companies have come out of NSF funding, Qualcomm and others, but it seemed more random and not as purposeful. So Errol had the vision to create a program called I-Corps, the Innovation Corps. And in I-Corps, the NSF would identify the most promising, most advancing scientists, put them in a program to take the pulse of the marketplace, to understand where there could be commercial value created. And Errol convened 25 of these teams at Stanford 5 years ago. And I was part of the teaching team with Steve Blank, who's the godfather of the lean startup movement, John Fiber from More David Al Ventures, John Burke from True Ventures. And the teaching team was essentially entrepreneurs and investors who didn't bring a scientific knowledge. We assumed the molecules would do what the engineer said it would do. But we brought a practical sense of who cares and how are you going to make money and can you bring this to market. And after the first day, 25 teams presenting in a very quick thumbnail version what they thought their business models would be. We were exhausted, and I checked in with Errol from the NSF view. How did he think the team was doing running the cohort? And Errol's feedback was terrific. He thought we were on top of it. It was amazing, so much learning going on. And then we confessed that we had no clue what was going on. There was so much information being conveyed so quickly. And if all it was a one and done 25 teams, we could survive the next 10 weeks. And then I asked Errol what his vision was for I-Corp. And Errol said, well, we're going to create nodes all around the country. Of course, I asked, what's a node? And he said, well, Stanford, Berkeley, and UCSF could be a node. Columbia, CUNY, and NYU could be a node. So they'd be regional centers of excellence. And they would be taking 25 teams of innovators from all over the country, and they'd bring them together for 3 days to learn the methodology, to learn the process. And there'd be 8 weeks of WebEx sessions so they could report in from the lab because they had to go back and get their work done. And they bring them back together at the end for not a demo day, not a pitch day, but a lessons learned day. I said, well, Errol, how many nodes might there be? He says, someday I think we'll have maybe 10 nodes. Okay. And how many teams in a cohort? Oh, we're going to stick with this 25 number. And how many cohorts per node per year? 2 or 3. So well, if every team does 100 interviews and there's 25 teams per cohort and there's 3 cohorts per year per node and there's 10 nodes, I said, Errol, you're going to have over 1 million data points within a couple of years. How are you going to know who are the best nodes, who are the best instructors, who are the best mentors, who are the best teams? How will you ever figure that out? And he said, well, I never really thought of it as a data problem. I was just worried about the basic execution of the program. And he learned about Steve's work in the course that he and I were teaching at Berkeley and Stanford through Steve's blog, but this experiment was doomed to fail because it wouldn't scale. And I said a foolish thing. I said, Errol, you need an operating system for innovation. He asked where he could get one. I told him that I didn't know of any, and so he said, well, you'll have to build one for me. And I brushed it off, and I said, I wasn't really coming here to do that. And he goes, well, you don't understand. The people in the back of the room are from the University of Michigan and from Georgia Tech. They're about to start their nodes, and I need something for them to use. So Launchpad Central was born with the initial purpose of serving the needs of the National Science Foundation's I-Corps program. Pretty modest objective. But what we learned is that the NSF, the NIH, the DoD, the DOE, 300 universities in 80 countries around the world now use this program as a way of going from ideation to execution and quickly determining what is and is not feasible in the marketplace. What we realized about 3 years ago is the problems are even larger in the large enterprise environment, where portfolios of innovation are a very real challenge, and yet the management tools don't exist to manage that agenda effectively and efficiently. We can go to the next slide. So as we look for ways to help organizations have a rapid fire decision-making process where they can take these most promising ideas that Spigit has helped identify and surface through Pairwise and other innovative technologies, how do we know with greater fidelity and certainty where the market will embrace these opportunities? So if we could click the next slide. What we've got is a series of challenges. Inside our buildings, we have employees with great knowledge of what is feasible. We need to keep an eye on the world around us, understand changes in technology, regulatory environment, competitive profiles, and we can ingest all of these reports, not mistaking them for clear views of the future, but a sense of what's possible. But what's been missing is getting outside the building and very often talking to customers early enough to make sure the innovations we develop resonate with what the customer's needs are. So if we can click on the next slide. What we've got is a situation where we start with the feasibility, the microscope of what's possible. We need to layer in the desirability. Where are customer discoveries able to give us evidence that that which we can build in some form is what the marketplace is looking for? The adaptability is, of course, making sure that we don't build yesterday's solution tomorrow. And our overlap, these 3 needs, generates for us, with one more click, the viability. And if something is both feasible, desirable, and adaptable, it gets a go. This is something you'll want to be investing in, but only when the clarity of the signal from the marketplace validates that what you can do is something you should do. So if we can take a look at the next slide, we've got the thing that Spigit has perfected, which is really understanding the leverage of the wisdom of crowds. In this case, the crowds are coming from within our organization. They're really looking at getting this diversity of opinion, understanding the independence of the groups, the individuals, how they collaborate, how they cooperate, and aggregating it so we can synthesize, analyze, and visualize the power of these ideas. But if you think about our innovation capital, which the next slide will show us, it's a combination of several key features. We've got talented people in organizations. They have robust ideas, a culture that is hopefully tolerant of the many failures on the road to success. But what we've often lacked is a way of capturing this institutional knowledge, what we like to sometimes refer to as the intellectual exhaust of all of these failed experiments. But if you can take the knowledge across teams, across divisions, and across time, if you can condense that exhaust into what could be jet fuel for the right team in the right place, you've leveraged all of that investment in future success. So a lot of companies have a slide somewhere in their deck of the moonshot. Joe Biden is now working on the moonshot for cancer, and there's different X Prize moonshots for different innovations across industries and within companies. But if we go back to the next slide, go forward to the next slide, the original moonshot, let me take us all back for a moment to 1960. Yuri Gagarin, Russian cosmonaut, circled the Earth. John Kennedy was viewing the galaxy as something we would lose to the communist threat of Russia. And he announced in 1960 that by the end of the decade, we're going to send a man to the moon and back. So if you were an astronaut in 1960, the announcement of the original moonshot would thrill you with opportunity. My career, this is what I've trained for, it's going to happen. I am possibly one of the most excited people on the planet. Until I do a little research. And I realized on the next slide that in 1960, there were 38 orbital launches, and 19 of them blew up. So imagine now if I'm that astronaut in 1960 and I have this data in front of me, I realized that with a flip of a coin, I could blow up or make it to the moon. And I'm not liking those odds. In fact, those are pretty formidable odds. So what happened is the newly formed National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, collaborated with the Department of Defense. You can imagine two federal agencies collaborating. And they were asked to come up with a way of measuring the maturity of technology, because we have to create so many new basic sciences to safely put a man on the moon. How is this possible, and how can we manage this complex national imperative and interest? So the next slide shows what these two federal agencies came up with. They developed a metric called the technology readiness level. And the TRL is basically going from a pencil sketch TRL1 to a breadboard prototype to a field test, and at TRL9 the science works. And so the question we asked ourselves is, why can't we do this for our innovation portfolio? Why can't we quantify the investment readiness level of an innovation initiative? And it turns out we can't. The higher up the IRL scale, the lower the risk. The same with the TRL scale. Do I have an initial business model hypothesis? Have I validated a customer segment? Do I have a minimum viable product? And as I begin reducing the risk through the evidence gathered from customer discovery, I am elevating the potential return on the investment to bring that innovation to market. And if you stop for a moment, every time a technology changes and pivots, while it may go up the investment readiness level chart, it is possible the market might have shrunk. It may have expanded. So there's a constant recursive process required to understand if the changes to make the risk lower still meet our thresholds for market size and profitability and viability. And so this is pretty tough. I mean, I understand how science might lend itself to a general norm of improvement, but there's so many kinds of innovation. Why do we think it's practical that we can develop a metric for innovation progress in an innovation portfolio? How can we really think this can happen? And again, the goal of all this is to accelerate the time to truth. I just gave a talk this morning where the average amount of time in the Industrial Research Institute portfolio of companies, and they're quite large companies with huge R&D budgets, is somewhere between 1 and 2 years to figure out if they're going to try and bring a product to market. That's a long time. And the reason for lack of metrics is it's hard to figure out what you want to do. But if on the next slide, if you've been to the supermarket any time in the last decade, you might have noticed that no matter what kind of food you buy, if you can click ahead, we've actually been able to quantify that there's a nutritional fact label on everything you buy, no matter what kind of food. If you're diabetic, you can avoid the sugar. If you've got a low-carb diet, you can avoid the carbohydrates. If you've got a blood pressure issue, you can avoid the salt. We know and understand intimately with decimal accuracy the building blocks of nutrition. I would present to you that we now understand the building blocks of innovation. And with a similar rigor to stating our hypotheses, running our experiments, and quantifying and gathering the evidence, we create the opportunity to leverage and scale our innovation portfolio. So let me slowly click you through a slide that hopefully won't build too quickly, but on the next page, stopping there, we've looked at 15,000 teams, 500,000 interviews, 50,000 pivots. And what we've learned is that teams are very often wrong. In fact, they're wrong 7.6 times for every time they're right. So if your culture can't handle lots of no, that's not right, it's going to be hard to innovate. But if every no gives you a chance to learn, well, what might work, it's kind of exciting. So if we click one time, we're going to show you what one of our corporate clients did with their first cohort. They took about 10 teams, and they went through this process, and we were very concerned. We had never seen teams do so poorly. They were validating almost nothing. Everything was wrong, but part of it was they didn't understand how to articulate what they really did know. They were saying that their customer segment was millennials. We explained that an 18-year-old fraternity boy at Purdue and a 27-year-old married female attorney in Manhattan with 2 kids are both technically millennials, and yet they have nothing in common. You have to really crisply define a customer segment. You have to understand how to articulate a value proposition. And they went through 10 weeks of real pain and torture. But then they did something brilliant. If we click one more time, they put a member of the first cohort as a mentor of the second cohort. They kind of knew what was and wasn't a good experiment. They really began to understand the kind of evidence they wanted to create. If you click one more time, by the time they ran their third cohort, they set the gold standard. They had learned to not fall in love with what they knew, but they developed an intense, insatiable curiosity to learn what they needed to know, not what they already knew. They were able to challenge key assumptions about market segments, channels, and partners. And if we look at the next slide, what ultimately happened is they took a process that took them 2 years to kill or fill an idea, to make an informed decision. Next slide, next click. They actually cut it to 8 weeks. So what they did is they took an 8-week process, an innovation sprint, but even more importantly, now that they've done 6,000 interviews, if you think of an innovation sprint as a group of professionals, typically 3 to 5 people, typically 6 to 10 weeks, if you think of it as a 100-yard dash, what they're able to do now is by repurposing and reanimating all of the evidence that's gone before them, they're effectively starting on the 20-yard line. Who else have we talked to with these companies? What other experiments have we run on this technology? What have we understood to be the case about the regulatory environment changing in Europe? And the teams out of the blocks, it's like watching a baton exchange in a relay race where the runners are both going at full speed, passing the baton, versus coming out of a cold start in the starting box. And what we've seen in the days before Salesforce.com and CRM systems is the power was in the Rolodex, that the salesman or saleswoman had their contacts, had their leads, and when they left the company, they took them with them. What we see now is a sense that those leads, those contacts, those calls are actually a corporate asset. If I were the main person responsible for General Motors and I left the company, Amy could come in tomorrow and know exactly where we were, what the correspondence was, what the proposals were, what the history was. She'd introduce herself, but she would be fully up to speed. And that chance of maintaining the momentum, the velocity, the speed only occurs when you've got a transparent collaborative system where all of the evidence and all the data can be shared across teams, across divisions, and across time. So if we take a look at the next slide, what we've got is the ability where Spigit and Glider are able to maximize the potential for success by finding the best of those ideas, accelerating the time to truth with a rigorous, quantifiable methodology that not only validates the feasibility of the opportunity, but the desirability in the marketplace and the viability based on understanding of what the costs are going to be as they are associated with rolling forth the project in its ever-evolving state. And there, again, is no product or project we've seen in the 15,000 teams we've worked with that wound up where it started. Amazon did not set out to be the world's largest cloud web services operator. If you can recall, they were going to just sell books. And Google's original business plan was a utility to run inside of large corporations behind the firewall to help them find data within their own organization. Dramatic changes for both companies, but they were informed by the market desirability for the things that their technology could enable. And if we go to the next slide, it really is about using and the leverage and the power of the Spigit engine to generate those ideas, to advance the best ideas, to dynamically construct teams with broad participation and engagement, and to pull out the divergent thinking, the pattern recognition skills of the organization. Because ultimately, better decisions are a function of pattern recognition, but what Glider's application from the Launchpad system gives you is a disciplined pattern acquisition tool. Basically, you have to collect the dots before you can connect the dots. So to validate the ideas with customers by getting out of the building, by advancing a business model with a variety of tools, including a business model canvas, to be able to build iterations of a concept, forms of what we would call a minimum viable product or products, so that the feedback loop is authentic and reflects the evolving state of the technology and the solution. And ultimately, the convergent validation, where all of the data generated through the Glider platform goes back into Spigit to inform that process and be broadly shared across the enterprise for the next level of challenges and opportunities. Next slide, please. So in terms of the developing market-ready innovation projects and the reason for the partnership between Spigit and Launchpad is really about that initial ideation, which is so hard to do, and the ability to prioritize from a broad basket of potential the ones that appear to have the greatest opportunity and promise, to take that into a project formation and vetting and validation where you can really understand that overlap between feasibility, where most projects are green-lighted, to desirability, but testing that again against the marketplace of adaptability and viability. And as you go out and test them, only then is the signal deemed strong enough to go and move it into an execution mode in the proper division, in the proper department, or sometimes in a new division, or sometimes even in a spin-out. But once you've got the business model that is repeatable and scalable, then and only then do you begin writing the business plan for execution. And a lot of times we get ahead of ourselves and we think that because we've written the plan, we can execute the plan, and we're often lacking that vital signal from the customers. So if we move to the next slide, I think Amy, we wanted to open up for some questions and see if we can drill deeper where our own customer discovery, where our audience today wants us to take this, and we'd like to see what those thoughts and what those questions might look like.
Great. So please, everybody, answer, put your questions in the question box, and Hannah will, in the meantime, as you're typing them in, I'm sure somebody's already typed one in. Hannah, can you give Jim and I a question?
Absolutely. We have a couple really great ones. So first question, how do I get my organization open and willing to accept and to implement ideas and take it to market?
So that's a great question. It's often having to do with a champion at a senior enough level for whom the visibility of the failures and the scars and the blemishes is not viewed as a career-limiting move, but in fact as an open opportunity to share knowledge. We've done some work with the Mayo Clinic, and when they do their final lessons learned in a large auditorium, not only are the peers of these professionals present, but the chief scientist of the Mayo Clinic is in the room. And this is a person you sort of dream of bumping into and can't, they would never have lunch with you. Gosh, would it be great to have a coffee? Because there's 50,000 people at the Mayo Clinic. I mean, this is not something that's easy to schedule. And yet, when that person's in the room, and even if the project is a no-go, which 80% of them are, when the chief scientist stands up and leads a standing ovation and expresses gratitude for how their work has helped the Mayo Clinic be better and smarter and advance its mission to better serve patients, it's pretty important. And so it's not just the people who win the blue or the gold medal, rather, and the blue ribbon that get acknowledged, but everyone whose effort is acknowledged is what fuels the culture of risk-taking and innovation. And I think that it really comes down to the culture issue. We talked about innovation capital and the perspective that having more patents filed is not a pathway to driving up value for the enterprise. It's having those technology innovations commercialized successfully, and that means we're going to be wrong more than we're right. Venture capitalists that are right 10% of the time are doing really well for their investors, because when they're right, they're really right, but they're wrong much more than they're right. So it really comes down to, I think, a cultural issue, and having enough people with either the political capital or the capabilities to run an experiment. And again, you view this as an experiment. When we talk to large companies and we say, well, so what are you doing now? And we listen. And we say, and how is that working for you? Because innovation isn't really the goal. It's growth and profitability. And innovation tends to be a code word for things aren't going as well as we need them or want them to go. We're now working with Google, and they would be a company that most people would think not have an innovation problem. But they have the same issue. They have scores of opportunities to invest capital, and they want to be more purposeful and thoughtful as they make those decisions, informed by the signals we help them acquire, manage, and quantify in the marketplace.
Great. Thank you, Jim. Next question, do you have any examples of minimum viable products that turned into successful products?
I'm sorry, Jim. Well, I wanted to give a couple of examples that people might be familiar with in terms of Spigit customers. One of the early products that was developed on Spigit was called the Polaris Slingshot, which is technically a three-wheeled motorcycle, but looks a little bit more like a Batmobile. And it's currently $1 billion market. I think many people, when they think of products, think of just physical objects, but many of our customers develop products that are services, that are new kinds of technology. Jim, do you find that with Launchpad as well, that it's a variety of quote-unquote products?
Yeah, in fact, we had a recent team whose minimum viable product was simply a Photoshop mock-up of a report that their innovation could generate. And they were showing that report to healthcare administrators as an example of how they could improve compliance with something as simple as cleaning your hands, washing your hands, using Purell, which you would think would happen all the time. And yet every time it doesn't happen in a hospital setting or a clinical setting, the exposure to risk of infection is increased. And they had a bunch of ideas of products and ways of doing it. And it turned out that they wanted to help quantify what had been previously difficult to quantify. And by showing reports to the administrators and said, imagine if I could get you a report like this, how would that change your business? How would that impact the way you provide your services? And when people leaned in and their pupils dilated and they said, gosh, how can I possibly get a report like that? That would be amazing. And they said, well, what would it be worth to get that report? Would you pay $1 million a year? No, I wouldn't pay that much. I wouldn't pay more than $100,000 a year. All right, well, now we know what it's worth. Can I build it in a way to deliver it where that economic opportunity makes sense for the company and for the customer? And so often people don't understand the minimum viable product. We have another example where it was more of a maximum product. There was a new material that had certain properties and qualities in terms of texture and weight and depth. And the company made the initial mistake of actually showing in a fully configured, beautifully tailored jacket what this material looked like. And the comments they got had to do with the jacket. The lapels are too wide, the pockets are too big. They actually had to take the jacket and cut it up into pieces so people could focus on the question, which is the material, its texture, its weight, its water permeability. And in that case, the refinement was too extreme to allow the feedback on the basic merits of the product. It turns out its best use wasn't in a jacket, it was in other applications, and they would never get there when they gave a demo, if you will, that was too baked and too complete.
Great. Our next question is about the Spigit and Launchpad partnership. How does Launchpad integrate with Spigit?
At a high level, I'll cover the Spigit side. Spigit has REST APIs that our partners can access for both the movement of ideas into and out of Spigit, as well as metadata around the ideas, comments, replies, etc. And via an integration, any of our partners can access that data and move it forward. Jim, you want to cover from your side?
Yeah, no, I think that the state of the art in phase one of our partnership is very much taking those ideas that have come through the Spigit process, beginning the commercialization experimentation phase, and then feeding back those results back to Spigit. We think that over time, since we both operate on open APIs, we'll find deeper levels of integration. And we want to make sure that, like we practice what we preach, that we prioritize those many opportunities based on where the market is telling us they create the greatest value in the near term. But I think what we have is an opportunity for a near seamless integration from ideation to commercialization through to execution. And the exciting opportunity that we see is the hard part for some organizations is actually putting those ideas on paper and filtering them. But once they're done, that universal pain of which of these are really the ones and how will they evolve and how quickly can we compress that evolution scale so that we wind up with the best possible opportunity at the least possible risk.
Great. Another very good question. What advice would you give someone who's looking to shrink the time it takes to go from idea to execution?
There is something about jumping in the water. And what we are, we really do eat our own dog food. And I think I've not seen an organization that's comfortable that they're doing it as fast or as efficiently as they can, even Google. And if you step back and say, well, I have a hypothesis or series of hypotheses, and try and frame intelligent experiments. By the way, that's really hard to do. And when I've done that, I want to really get out of the building. I want to test these hypotheses. I want to get that evidence, and I want to understand how to make better decisions. So we will quickly deploy an A/B test. Take what you've done, see what those timelines are, see what those results are, and compare it to this alternative. When that's done with an eye toward metrics and outcomes, we believe that we've made a substantial improvement in the status quo and the processes that are currently being used and deployed. And our own methodology is informed, frankly, by the success of our clients. What we've learned is certain activity metrics and ratios that we could only learn by not looking, by being able to look at the aggregate of 15,000 teams of innovators, by learning from 500,000 customer discovery interviews globally in every different industry and sector you can imagine. There are still common behaviors of success and failure. And if you're able to manage diversity of a team, the resiliency that a team needs to have, and the adaptability to be able to change in light of the conditions as you bring them back from customer discovery, those are the teams and the organizations that accelerate through the process very quickly. Typical 8 to 10 week process, but you can get to know very quickly. Sometimes teams will shut down their ideas in 2 or 3 weeks, when in fact the signal they assumed would be there because of all of their internal and well-intended perspectives and biases are actually not validated. And that's the danger of trying to build a innovation portfolio based on market research. Our co-founder Steve Blank is fond of saying that market researchers are famous at predicting the past. And if they could really predict the future, they would be running a hedge fund and they'd be billionaires. But the future is hard. And all of our innovation efforts are trying to make that visibility a little better and to help organizations leverage their unfair advantages in technology, in distribution, in partnerships, in customer segments, so they can accelerate their time to truth. And the only way to see if that works is to jump in and try it.
Wonderful. We'll go ahead and end with one last question. What things should we avoid when bringing ideas to market?
Can I say a couple things and then Jim hand it over to you?
Please.
I think at a high level, Spigit believes firmly that ideas from a group of 5 smart people in a room are not the way to go. We've seen over and over again that the best ideas come from not just diverse groups of people, but as your business, you think about other divisions, they bring just completely new perspectives. And for us, fundamental, it's to start with the right idea and the best idea that's actually out there. And when you limit yourself to just the ideas from one group or one small set of folks, you really are limiting the future of the company. And so before it even goes into validation, you may not even have the best ideas that are available. I would start there. Find the best ideas that are available and ask often about them. That's where success comes from the Spigit customers. And Jim, at the point that it's handed over from Spigit, any advice for people to think about?
Yeah, I would say that the biggest mistake and the thing to avoid is assuming that that idea is done and that in its final form it's ready to go. That's why we have warehouses full of products no one wants to buy, or misdefined opportunities that are just 10 degrees off center. The reason companies that are successful are because they're really great at execution, and execution means focus, and focus means looking straight ahead. The innovation space is about peripheral vision, about flexibility, and about looking around you. So oddly enough, the ambidextrous organization has to be able to do both. They have to be able to execute and discover. And the biggest burden in bringing a product to market is prematurely judging its certitude of success in the absence of direct market feedback, which often can be subtle or dramatic changes in that idea, whether it's through channel, partnerships, pricing models, different ways of customer relations. There's a lot of moving parts. And in a division that's been successfully executing a plan for a long time, polishing the edges of that, easy. Got to keep doing it. Got to keep doing process control, Horizon 1 innovation. But as the level of uncertainty is increasing, then the level of adaptability in the organization is critical. For those who've ever tried to snow ski, and have ever tried to do it without bending their knees, they are certain to fall. But the idea of having innovation with your knees bent, to be able to respond, to be resilient, to take the moguls and the bumps and stay upright and continue on the journey is the one safe way to get to the bottom of the hill. So it really is hitting the go, hitting the pedal, flooring it prematurely is where the biggest failures occur. And we can go back and look at pets.com and Webvan and all of the colossal failures of the last decade. And the learning from that, and there's a great analysis done on a business portfolio project in Silicon Valley. They said the biggest problem in technology was premature scaling. Well, premature scaling is an oxymoron. All it means is we were wrong, but we spent the money anyway. And the current article in the Stanford Graduate School of Business Journal talks about great advances in technology are not planned, they are discovered. And so there is that evolutionary change to first find those ideas, but to ultimately filter, evolve, and fund them. And it's that filtering and evolution stage that's been, I think, largely either ignored or misunderstood for the power it can bring to an organization that embraces that uncertainty and tries to manage it and accelerate that time to optimize the outcomes. And I think that's together where Spigit and Launchpad create an end-to-end solution that allows companies to be much more purposeful and opportunistic in how they manage their innovation portfolio capital.
Great. Thank you, Jim, so much. I hope everybody enjoyed today's session with Spigit and Launchpad. And the recording and the slides will be sent out to everybody.